On the morning of February 8, 1986, two trains travelled toward each other through the mountains of Western Canada. Both crews had clear signals and were exactly where they should have been. Yet, minutes later, they would collide head-on in what was Canada's worst rail disaster. When investigators dug deeper, they found something deeply disturbing. Nothing had failed, and yet somehow, one train had ignored every warning placed in front of it. This is the story of the Hinton Train Collision. At around 6:40 a.m. on the 8th of February 1986, a Canadian National Freight train, number 413, departed Edson in west-central Alberta, heading west toward Jasper. Consisting of 3 locomotives and a whopping 115 freight cars, stretching almost 6,000 feet, it carried grain, sulfur, pipes, and tank cars with industrial chemicals. The locomotive engineer was 48-year-old Jack Hudson. The brakeman riding up front with him was 25-year-old Mark Edwards. At the rear of the train, riding in the caboose, was the conductor, 33-year-old Wayne Smith. The line between Edson and Jasper consisted of both single and double-tracked sections. At around 8:20 a.m., Canadian National Train 413 reached the Hergwin control point, where the single line turned to double, and they continued westward on their journey. At about the same time, Via Rail's supercontinental passenger service, carrying 94 passengers and 21 crew, was departing Hinton, heading east toward Edmonton, approximately 5 minutes behind schedule. The supercontinental passenger train was actually 2 services combined into one. The front section had begun its journey in Vancouver, while the rear half had started a day before in Prince Rupert. They were combined at Jasper, forming a single eastbound service known simply as Train Number 4, carrying families, travellers, and crew making the long journey across Canada. 2 trains travelled toward each other, one carried passengers, the other freight. It was a routine morning on the Canadian Railway, until it wasn't. Canadian National Train Number 413 continued west along the double-track section toward Dalehurst. At Dalehurst, they would stop and wait for the eastbound Via passenger train to pass before entering onto the single line. Put simply, Train 413 needed to stop at the end of the double track and hold position until the passenger train had passed. An approach signal, located 2.5 miles from the end of the double track, came into view, displaying yellow over red. What this meant was, the crew of the freight train should begin slowing to 30 miles per hour and prepare to stop at the next signal. The next signal, positioned at the very end of the double track, controlled entry onto the single line. However, as the freight train passed the approach signal, something was wrong. Instead of slowing to 30, it was going 59 miles per hour and speeding up. At the rear of the train, conductor Wayne Smith noticed the problem and would later claim to have tried to contact the engineer by radio. However, he had gotten no response. We'll dive into that point later in the video. Regardless, as the conductor, regulations required that if communication with the locomotive crew could not be established, he should activate the emergency brake from the caboose. He did not, and they continued speeding toward the end of the double-tracked section. At around 8:39 a.m., Canadian National Train 413 reached the stop signal at Dalehurst and the end of the double-tracked section. Instead of stopping though, it forced its way through the track switch, damaging the points and entering onto the single track occupied by the Via supercontinental passenger train. Despite likely 19 seconds of visual contact, neither train applied the brakes. At 8:40 a.m., at a combined speed of 108 miles per hour, Via Rail supercontinental passenger train and Canadian National Train 413 collided head-on in what was Canada's worst rail disaster to date. In the immediate aftermath, the destruction was overwhelming. The impact destroyed the lead locomotives and fuel tanks ruptured, igniting a fireball that engulfed the front portion of the wreckage. Freight cars piled into each other, while passenger coaches were thrown from the track. From the rear of the freight train, conductor Wayne Smith saw the explosion ahead. Believing a derailment had occurred farther up the train, he grabbed a radio, jumped from the caboose, and attempted to contact the engineer. Getting no response, he contacted train dispatch and reported that something had gone wrong near the front of the train and that he had seen a large explosion. Meanwhile, the wreckage continued to burn. The collision had hurled freight cars into the air and crushed the front passenger coach beneath the impact. Surviving passengers smashed windows and climbed out to escape. Grain from ruptured hopper cars spilled across the wreckage, in some places smothering flames long enough for trapped survivors to crawl free. When all was said and done, 23 people were dead. Among them were both locomotive crews and 18 passengers from the Ford coach, while 71 others were injured. Across the tracks laid a tangled mass of destroyed locomotives, freight cars, and passenger coaches. Canada had just witnessed its worst rail disaster since 1947, but why had the freight train ignored the signals, and why had neither train applied the brakes? In the days and weeks following the tragedy, the Canadian government launched a public inquiry. Investigators first examined the signalling system. Tests confirmed that the signals worked correctly and that all lights displayed the correct colours. The approach signal had clearly warned the freight to slow, while the following one had told it to stop. 413 should never have entered the single track. Attention then turned to the crews. Toxicology ruled out alcohol or illicit substances. However, investigators learned that freight train engineer Jack Hudson had serious medical issues. He was an alcoholic, a heavy smoker, and suffered from pancreatitis and type 2 diabetes, conditions that placed him at an increased risk of heart attack or stroke. But none of this yet explained the crash. Through their inquiries, investigators uncovered a deeper issue with Canadian National. Justice Renee Foisey described it as a railroader culture, an environment where productivity and loyalty to co-workers were often valued above strict safety protocols. One example involved the dead man's pedal used in the locomotive. The system required an engineer to keep his foot pressed on a pedal while driving. If the pedal was released, an alarm would sound and the brakes would automatically apply. The system would stop a train if the engineer became incapacitated or fell asleep. However, it was common knowledge that some engineers found it uncomfortable and would place heavy objects on the pedal to keep it pressed. Whether this occurred on train 413 can never be known because the locomotives were destroyed in the impact. After weeks of testimony, the inquiry reached its conclusions. Investigators determined that the crew of the freight train failed to respond to the signals for unknown reasons. We will delve into the most plausible reasons for this shortly, but investigators speculated that sleep, or even a heart attack or stroke, could have occurred. Given there were two in the cab, I find the latter two less likely. It would appear the most likely possibility was that the front-end crew of 413 had both fallen asleep. Reports examining the crew's schedule in the hours leading up to the crash suggested they'd had very little sleep in the hours before their shift. However, this raised another disturbing question. Why had conductor Wayne Smith not applied the emergency brake from the caboose when his attempts to contact the front-end crew had failed? If communication with the front-end crew could not be established, regulations required him to activate the emergency brake to bring the train to a stop. Smith claimed in the hearing he had repeatedly tried to contact the front-end crew by radio. However, this was contradicted by other crews operating in the area on the same channel, who said they never heard such calls. Ultimately, his testimony was found unreliable, and the contradiction raised further doubts. Investigators were left to consider whether he had also been asleep. There was still one last mystery. Neither the freight train nor the passenger train had applied the brakes despite a probable 19 seconds of visual contact. No explanation for the passenger train not braking could be found, although, even if it had, it would have made no difference, and investigators stressed the VIA train was not at fault. In the end, the official cause of the accident was listed as crew fatigue and human failure, and no criminal charges were laid. The Hinton Train Collision remains one of Canada's most sobering and mysterious rail disasters. What happened inside the freight train in the final minutes may never be known. Whether the crew had fallen asleep, became distracted, or suffered a medical emergency, the answer died with them in the wreckage. That's all for today's video. If you found value in it, I'd love it if you subscribed and joined me for the next one. And as always, thanks for watching.